History has a way of hiding its strangest truths. But scattered across ancient walls, forgotten tombs, and crumbling papyrus scrolls, Egypt left behind images that challenge everything we thought we knew. These are not the pharaohs from your textbooks. These are the ones history tried to forget. Ancient Egypt endured for over 3,000 years. It built monuments that still defy explanation. It produced rulers of terrifying power and priests who held secrets stranger than any legend. But hidden within its ruins are figures that never quite fit the official story. People who were extraordinary, misunderstood, feared, or simply unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen before. Through rare paintings, temple carvings, papyrus illustrations, and archaeological records, we can finally look them in the eye. One of the most startling discoveries made near the temple complex of Karnak was a series of carved reliefs depicting a figure of unusual proportions standing among the royal court. Scholars have long debated what this image represents. The figure towers over soldiers and priests alike, its dimensions clearly deliberate, not symbolic. Ancient Egyptian art did use scale to communicate status, but this carving breaks from that convention entirely. The surrounding figures are shown in standard court attire, suggesting a real scene, not a divine allegory. Some researchers now believe this may be among the earliest visual records of a person with gigantism in the ancient world. Few figures appear more frequently in ancient Egyptian art than the god Bez, a dwarf deity with a lion's mane, a protruding tongue, and a fierce expression. He was not a minor deity. He was placed in birthing chambers, tattooed on the thighs of dancers, and carved into the walls of royal palaces. What makes this especially fascinating is the visual record of real dwarfs who served in the Egyptian court. Paintings from noble tombs show small-statured individuals in positions of high trust, managing jewels, leading animals, and standing close to the pharaoh. In Egypt, a dwarf was not an object of ridicule. He was considered touched by the divine. A rare painted scene discovered inside a Middle Kingdom tomb shows a man identified by inscription as Khnumhotep, depicted with a visibly curved spine and shortened limbs. What makes this image remarkable is not just its medical detail, but the dignity with which this man is portrayed. He is shown seated, receiving offerings, surrounded by family. He was clearly a person of standing. Scholars studying skeletal remains from the same period have confirmed that individuals with severe spinal conditions did survive well into adulthood in ancient Egypt, suggesting real medical support and social acceptance that is rarely discussed in popular history. Among the wall paintings recovered from a lesser-known tomb in the Valley of the Nobles, there is a figure that stands apart from every other person in the composition. His skin is painted white, not in the symbolic way used for the dead or for certain gods, but in a way consistent with how Egyptian artists depicted unusual physical traits. His eyes are rendered with a distinctive reddish tint. Scholars now believe this is one of the oldest known artistic representations of a person with albinism. That he appears in a priestly context suggests he may have been considered spiritually significant, a person living between the human world and the divine. No image from ancient Egypt challenges modern assumptions more powerfully than the painted limestone statue of Seneb, a high-ranking court official who lived during the Old Kingdom. Seneb was a dwarf, and yet he is shown seated in a position of absolute authority, with his wife beside him, her arm around his shoulder in a gesture of affection, and his children depicted below. His wife stands full height. His expression is one of complete composure. He was the overseer of all royal dwarfs, a title that carried real administrative power. This statue, now housed in the Cairo Museum, is one of the most humanizing images to survive from the ancient world. In the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, where the craftsmen who built the royal tombs lived and died, Archaeologists discovered mummies and figurines bearing geometric tattoo patterns across their abdomens, thighs, and chests. Some of these patterns were associated with fertility and protection during childbirth. Others were clearly decorative. The women who bore these markings were not royalty. They were the wives and daughters of skilled laborers. Painted images from the same village show these women at work, at celebration, and at mourning, their bodies marked with symbols that gave them identity and power in a world that rarely left records of ordinary lives. A hunting scene painted on the wall of a New Kingdom tomb shows a group of archers pursuing gazelle across the desert. Among them is a figure rendered with clear anatomical intention. One sleeve hangs empty, the arm is absent. And yet this figure stands at the front of the group, bow raised, posture confident. Egyptian artists did not include detail without meaning. This man was not a background figure. He was placed prominently in the composition, participating fully in one of the most celebrated activities of elite Egyptian society. The image is one of the earliest known depictions of a person with limb difference in a context of complete social inclusion. No figure in Egyptian history has generated more mystery than Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who abandoned the gods of Egypt and worshipped only the sun disk. But beyond his religious revolution, it is his physical representation that has fascinated researchers for over a century. And temple carvings and statues from his reign show him with an elongated skull, a narrow face, wide hips, a distended abdomen, and unusually long fingers. These are not the idealized proportions of traditional Egyptian art. Several medical theories have been proposed, including Marfan syndrome and a rare hormonal disorder. Whatever the cause, Akhenaten ordered artists to depict him as he truly was, or as he truly believed himself to be. Among the most poignant images from ancient Egyptian visual culture is a type of tomb painting known today as the blind harper scene. In these compositions, a musician is shown playing a large harp, eyes closed or depicted without pupils, a subtle but deliberate artistic choice indicating blindness. These scenes appear across multiple dynasties, suggesting that blind musicians held a recognized and respected role in Egyptian ceremonial life. In some versions, the harper is shown performing directly before the tomb owner, an honor reserved for the most valued entertainers. The accompanying inscriptions are among the most philosophically rich texts to survive from antiquity, encouraging the listener to enjoy life because death comes for everyone. Long before the Hollywood version, the Scorpion King was a real figure from Egypt's pre-dynastic period, one of the earliest rulers whose name has survived in carved form. Among the artifacts associated with his reign is a ceremonial palette that includes a small figure in a subordinate position, depicted with an asymmetrical body and a leg, rendered at an unnatural angle. Given the precision with which Egyptian artists worked even in this early period, scholars believe this was an intentional representation of a real person, possibly a servant or ritual attendant with a physical disability. The presence of such a figure on a ceremonial object suggests his role was considered meaningful, not marginal. Ancient Egyptian religious texts and administrative records make occasional reference to a category of temple servants described in ways that modern scholars interpret as intersex or gender nonconforming individuals. Some served in the temples of Amun, where ritual purity was paramount. A few painted scenes from temple antechambers show figures whose physical appearance was rendered ambiguously with mixed stylistic conventions normally used separately for male and female subjects. Whether these individuals were venerated, tolerated, or simply recorded is difficult to determine. But their presence in sacred spaces suggests that Egypt's understanding of the human body was far more nuanced than most popular accounts acknowledge. When archaeologists excavated the royal cemetery at Amarna, the short-lived capital built by Akhenaten, they discovered skeletal remains with unusually elongated cranial structures. Some of these belonged to members of the royal family. The elongation was partially natural in some cases, partially the result of a now debated practice of deliberate head shaping in infancy. Paintings and carvings from the Amarna period show royal children with distinctly cone-shaped heads, presented not as deformity, but as beauty, in a city built around a single divine light. Physical difference appears to have been reframed as spiritual distinction. These images remain among the most unsettling and beautiful things Egypt left behind. During excavations near the temple precinct of Luxor, a skeleton was uncovered that showed significant bone erosion consistent with advanced leprosy. But what made the discovery unusual was the burial context. This individual had not been cast out. The body had been carefully wrapped, placed in a prepared grave, and provided with modest burial goods. A painted wooden fragment found nearby, possibly from a funerary chest, shows a figure whose face is depicted with deliberate irregularity, patches of discoloration rendered in pigments rarely used for human skin. Scholars believe this may be a portrait object associated with the burial, making it one of the oldest known visual records of leprosy anywhere in the ancient world. A small carved figurine discovered in a domestic context near Memphis depicts a man with a pronounced dorsal hump, short stature, and hands raised in what appears to be a gesture of blessing or protection. An inscription near the base gives the name Henu. Figurines like this were placed in homes and workshops as protective charms, meaning that the image of a person with a physical difference was associated not with misfortune, but with good fortune and divine protection. Similar objects have been found across multiple sites and dynasties, suggesting this was not a local tradition, but a widespread belief embedded in everyday Egyptian life. Hatshepsut is perhaps the most famous example of a woman who held absolute power in ancient Egypt. But she is not the only one. What makes her visual record extraordinary is the deliberate transformation documented in her own monuments. Early images show her in female dress. Later temple carvings and statues show her wearing the double crown, the false beard, and the kilt of a male pharaoh. She did not hide her identity, she expanded it. After her death, a successor ordered many of her images destroyed, her face chiseled from temple walls. But enough survived to trace the full arc of a life that refused the categories available to it. A painted limestone relief from the New Kingdom shows a scribe seated in an unusual posture, one leg extended in front of him at an angle that Egyptologists initially assumed was an artistic convention. Further analysis of the proportions and the careful rendering of the leg suggested otherwise, and the limb is thinner than the other, the ankle drawn inward. Comparative study with skeletal remains from the period helped confirm that this appears to be a representation of post-polio syndrome, a condition that causes one-sided muscle atrophy. The scribe is shown fully at work, surrounded by the tools of his profession, his physical condition acknowledged, but in no way diminishing his status. In the medical papyri of ancient Egypt, among the earliest medical documents ever written, there are case descriptions that scholars have interpreted as referring to conjoined infants. One passage describes the treatment of 2 children born, joined at the chest, with detailed observations about breathing and feeding. Whether this represents a real case or a mythological reference has been debated, but the clinical precision of the language suggests direct observation. No surviving visual record has been conclusively linked to this description, but the existence of the medical notation itself tells us something important. Egypt looked at the full range of human possibility and wrote it down. Among the military records and tomb paintings from the New Kingdom, there are several images of Nubian soldiers serving in the Egyptian army. Most are depicted in standard proportions. But one tomb painting, discovered in the Theban necropolis, shows a soldier from the south rendered at a scale that clearly exceeds his companions, even accounting for artistic convention. His equipment is shown adapted to his size, his spear longer, his shield broader. The accompanying inscription describes him with a phrase that scholars have translated as something close to the great one of his kind. He appears to have been a celebrated figure, his unusual stature treated as military asset rather than anomaly. Temple records from the late period of Egyptian history make reference to an oracle based at a sanctuary near Abydos, who was described in administrative documents as one who sees without eyes. Whether this refers to blindness, to a ritual practice of covered eyes, or to a metaphysical claim about divine sight is unclear. What survives is a small carved plaque showing a seated figure with smooth, featureless plains where the eyes should be, surrounded by symbols associated with prophecy and divine speech. The absence of eyes in the carving was clearly deliberate. In a culture that gave enormous attention to the eye as a symbol of protection and power, their absence carried its own tremendous meaning. In the necropolis of Dra Abu el Naga, on the west bank of Luxor, excavators discovered the mummy of an adult male whose bones showed extensive evidence of healing after severe burns, likely suffered years before death. The scarring pattern visible in the skeletal record covered much of the upper torso and one side of the skull. Despite these injuries, the individual had lived for what appears to be several more decades. He had been mummified with care and placed in a painted coffin. Facial reconstruction based on the skull produced an image of a man with deep asymmetrical scarring and a partially fused jaw, a face that history preserved without apology. Among the most extraordinary royal documents to survive from the Old Kingdom is a letter written by the young pharaoh Pepi II to an official named Harkhuf, who was returning from an expedition deep into Central Africa. Harkhuf had brought back a dancing dwarf, and the child pharaoh wrote with barely contained excitement, promising lavish rewards greater than those given to the bringers of treasures from Punt. The letter survives, inscribed on the walls of Harkhuf's tomb. What it reveals is not just royal enthusiasm, but a cultural fascination with the extraordinary human form. The dwarf was not a servant or a slave. He was a spectacle of wonder that a pharaoh treasured above gold. In a series of ritual paintings discovered in a provincial temple from the Third Intermediate Period, there is a figure depicted wearing a cat mask in a context that is clearly not symbolic. Surrounding figures wear standard priestly attire. This person is shown in full cat-headed regalia, performing what appears to be a healing ritual. Some scholars believe this represents an actual practitioner who adopted the identity of Bastet so completely that her visual identity became merged with the goddess. Others suggest this was a specific priestly role assigned to individuals with unusual physical characteristics, their perceived strangeness channeled into sacred service. Either interpretation makes this one of the most haunting images in the Egyptian record. Egyptian literature occasionally references individuals who retreated into the desert, the Red Land beyond the fertile banks of the Nile, and lived in deliberate isolation. One such figure appears in a Middle Kingdom narrative known only from a single damaged papyrus. He is described as a man of altered appearance, his skin darkened beyond the normal range, his hair grown long and matted, his body adapted to the desert in ways that seemed unnatural to those who encountered him. He is consulted as a sage, his strangeness treated as evidence of wisdom. The papyrus is fragmentary, but the illustration that accompanies it shows a figure that looks like no other person in the Egyptian visual record. In one of the more extraordinary passages of the Westcar Papyrus, a document that preserves several of the oldest stories ever written, there is a brief reference to a woman described in terms that suggest extreme physical alteration. The phrase used has been translated variantly as iron teeth, black teeth, or teeth of stone, depending on the scholar. Whether this refers to dental dye, ritual filing, or a medical condition is unknown. But the visual tradition that accompanied storytelling in ancient Egypt was rich, and several painted vessels from the same period show female figures with darkened or exaggerated dental features in ritual contexts. Egypt did not flinch from the strange. It made the strange sacred. The god Hapi, personification of the Nile flood, was depicted in ancient Egyptian art with a combination of features considered distinctly male and distinctly female: a full beard alongside a pronounced chest, and pendulous forms associated with fertility and abundance. This was not an accident of style. It was a deliberate theological statement. What is less discussed is the archaeological evidence of real individuals whose physical bodies were rendered in similar terms in funerary contexts. At least 2 mummies from the New Kingdom have been identified with physical characteristics that resist simple binary classification. Their burial contexts were standard, their grave goods unremarkable. They were not buried as exceptions. They were buried as Egyptians. In the deepest chamber of a tomb discovered in the 1990s near Saqqara, behind sealed doors that had not been opened in over 2,000 years, archaeologists found a single painted portrait on the rear wall. The figure depicted was not a pharaoh. It was not a god. It was an ordinary person, a man of perhaps 40 years, shown full face in a style almost never used in Egyptian funerary art, which traditionally favored the profile. His left eye was rendered higher than the right. One side of his face was slightly smaller than the other. He looked, in short, like a real person, not idealized, not corrected, not transformed. After 3,000 years, he looked directly at the people who opened the door, and he looked like someone you might have known. These 26 figures remind us that ancient Egypt was never the monolithic civilization of myth and spectacle. It was a human place, full of people who were born different, who lived differently, who were feared and revered, and sometimes both at once. Their images survive because Egypt recorded what it saw, not always with compassion, not always with understanding, but with a precision and a persistence that allowed the strange and the singular to outlast the ordinary. Every one of these faces, carved or painted or described in faded ink, was a person who existed, who walked beside the Nile, who looked up at the same stars. The monuments may belong to the pharaohs, but the real history of Egypt belongs to all of them. If these forgotten faces of ancient Egypt surprised you, there is far more waiting to be discovered. Subscribe and stay close, because history's strangest stories are only just beginning.